Thank you, Nikki, and thank you, everybody, for having me today here. So today I'm going to present a reflection on the impact of an internationalization experience via digital platform based on views, opinions, and experience of students and tutors. This presentation is in behalf of myself and my colleagues, Mark Breslin from the University of Glasgow and Anna Maria Mariani from the University Niccolò Cusano. The rationale of our study is based on the realization during the COVID-19 pandemic that internationalization would have been quite impossible for our students, intended as students' mobility. We know that internationalization is very important for several reasons, such as economical reasons, for example, but internationalization is also responsible for giving our students the opportunity to develop further skills, such as the 21st century skills, so communication, intercultural understanding. And to allow our students to undertake this experience, even during the COVID-19 pandemic, we decided to focus on another type of internationalization, which is known as internationalization at home and internationalization at a distance. To do so, we looked at the literature and we realized that one of the most prevalent literature, the Hadzik 2020, specified that a focus on developing a culture of mutual support and strategic inclusion with partner universities with potential development of curriculum inclusive of dual-purposing resource and mutual enrichment was the best strategy to go ahead with our plans. So in order to do so, we decided to look at different objectives. So we wanted to give our students the international experience to develop their skills, but we also had to look on how to do so. And so the COVID-19 pandemic gave us a good support in that because we used digital platforms. In this way, we had also the opportunity to develop the IT skills of our students. We improved in that way undergraduate employability, or that was one of our objectives. And we looked into also how the mutual enrichment between the two cohorts of students that we involved in our study could support the knowledge exchange and could make possible for our students to develop those intercultural skills. And nevertheless, also international networking. So our research question was very basic, and we carried out the qualitative study. How might remote cooperative teaching based on mutual enrichment across international IT institutions support the active participation of students in international activities? We had highlighted there 3 keywords: remote cooperative teaching. So that was based on collaboration between tutors that took place by having several meetings before our intervention. We had to study each other policies for the education systems, and we did this into an ethos of equality, because both of institutions had a huge importance in giving their contribution. We also looked at mutual enrichment, because that was extremely important for us. The knowledge exchange would have to be very strong between our students. And then the active participation. Now, let me just spend another word about the active participation, because we knew that by using digital platforms, quite often students would disengage with the activities that we could promote. So we looked into how could we promote more active participation in international workshops. And we realized that the only way we had was to embed all the outcomes of our workshops in the assessment. To do so, we looked at the 2 universities involved assessments, and we developed a formative assessment based on an artifact produced during our workshops for the University of Glasgow, and an oral assessment for the University Niccolò Cusano, as it was for their assessment agenda. We involved 2 cohorts of students, undergraduate students from the University of Glasgow and students attending Scienze della Formazione from University of Niccolò Cusano. We carried out 4 sessions, and the strength in those sessions was that tutors had collaborated together to cooperative teach, but also that our tutors could speak both languages. And there was one of the tutors that had experience of the education system in Italy as a student and the education system in Scotland as teacher. That was an help that our participants highlighted as extremely important for them. We collected our data through several different mediums. We looked, first of all, during each session to students' feedback. And we analyzed, to do so, we used Padlet, Mentimeter, and we started to ask students, how is the experience going? How are you communicating with each other? What type of platform are you using when you are not in the synchronous sessions with us? And all this information helped us to shape the questions for our focus group. So we did have specific themes that we wanted to look at, and I pointed them out before: the remote cooperative teaching, the active participation, and the mutual enrichment. We added to that also a topic of common interest, because we realized that to promote effective learning there, we had to make sure that the topic we were basing our workshop upon was of interest for both countries. At that point, we decided to go for parental engagement. And we had a lot of interest from the Italian student, because in Italy, parental engagement does not work in the same way as in Scotland. So parents are involved in the students, in their children's education, but mainly as homework, because they go back home at 1 o'clock and then they have their lunch at home and they do their homework at home. In Scotland, it's different. Parents are highly involved as a community. So schools try to build up this sense of community with parents, which is not happening in Italy. So the 2 students had huge curiosity on this topic and exchanged their learning and their knowledge through the digital platforms. So we shaped our focus groups on students' feedback and the themes that we wanted to look at. The results were really encouraging. We had several feedback from students looking into how this experience had really enriched them with a deep knowledge exchange between the 2 countries. Very interestingly, they exchanged a lot of information on diet, because part of the tasks that we produced was to have a PowerPoint on how would you engage parents in some of the school activities in primary schools. And they all went for food and how food could be cooked in different countries. So they had an exchange on the diet in Scotland as well as the Mediterranean diet. That was a very big topic for them. Then they also mentioned that they felt the professional development was strong, especially in a different way. So Italian students had a huge concern at the beginning that they could be considered inferiors. They used this word, inferior. The reason for that is because they thought, I am going to be judged by the Scottish students because I cannot speak English properly. So they had this internal barrier that was a preconception that they had. The Scottish students, on the other side, they were very worried that they were not inclusive enough. They thought, how am I going to make this colleague of mine or peer of mine feeling good, feeling that they are valued? I want to know from them. And they had put in place a lot of strategies that we had taught before. So we created this framework that could be used for planning further experiences like this one in terms of internationalization. We felt that our students had developed several communication skills, and that, I'm just going to skip this because this picture would help me more. Their communication skills were supported by the digital technology that we used, because by using Zoom as a platform, they had the chance then to access Google Translator, and every word that was a bit difficult for them to understand what it was, they just put into the Google Translator for communication to be more effective. They were so keen to be understood that they put a huge effort into that, so much that then Italian students said, I feel good, I felt valued, I felt in a family. And the reason for that is because two reasons. First, the Scottish students had worked really hard to include them, but also the sessions that we delivered were delivered in both languages. So I was translating there on the spot if something was wrong. And because I had this possibility to understand the two systems, I could also transfer that understanding to them. And they said, I felt that by hearing my own language into an English session made me feel that my language was important, just as important as English is for communication around the world. So we decided to go, we decided this model works, and we decided to go even farther. And in fact, at the moment, this work is used in a project with India. So we are producing new workshops, this time with schools in India, and we are doing this around the topic of STEM, this time instead than parental engagement. So the topic of interest for both as STEM for both countries, Scotland and India, but we are using our framework in terms of mutual enrichment, active participation, and cooperative teaching. This time by using a specific pedagogy, which is participatory pedagogy. So our participants become also authors of our papers. And in fact, all the participants of our workshops with India have presented our findings in a conference, they are now publishing with me on a paper. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that this was in somehow inspiring, and I'm open to questions.
I actually have a question. I was really interested in the comment about the speaking of the language made a difference. How will you deal with that in your Indian study?
For the Indian teachers, we had a different setup, because in India, English is spoken as a second language in families as well, so it's not as much as in Italy, the difference. However, we collaborated with tutors from the Isar Pune Institute, and the tutors had translated all the resources in Marathi and Hindi. So we had one note escape room, and the escape room riddles were written for one page in English, for the second page in Marathi. So in this way, the students had to collaborate with each other to help and support their group to solve the riddles and being able to leave the Zoom room, because otherwise they would have been on Zoom with me until they would finish their one note. So we tried another strategy to try to promote the bilingual aspect of it.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I have a question about the social media platforms used in the study. I have done my PhD research is very similar topics. In my experience, students from different cultural contexts may hold different opinions about different social media platforms. And I wonder whether you have observed something similar in your study, and how is this discussed by the participants?
Thank you so much for the question, and I'm so glad you asked something like this, because my study that I'm doing just now after this experience is based on the social media. So we have different perception of the social media based on their experience, as you say. In fact, in the study that I'm doing with India, for example, as well as this study, Scottish students are more used to Google Classroom and Teams, while students in Italy could not really use Teams with every function. So what they did to try to overcome the issue was to use emails to share material, Then they used Zoom, that was for both of them quite accessible. They used Zoom to do meetings, but we also offered them the possibility to use open database, which is called Figshare. And basically, everybody could upload in our project folder on the Figshare all the resources, and that was accessible no matter what country you are, because it's an open database. So we tried to go around the issue, but it was very important that this issue was made clear to us by the participants themselves, because I would have not known that Italian students would have had a problem with Teams, or maybe that Indian participants, they prefer WhatsApp, because WhatsApp has a very low band. So you can use WhatsApp in rural areas, and there is no problem with that. So we had to make a WhatsApp group, which was really interesting, because I would get messages at 2 or 3 o'clock in the night due to the difference of time. And so the actual possibility to switch off the sound of that group for the messages was coming quite handy at that point.
Next study.
Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody, and it's great to see you at my presentation. I'm Georgina Smith, and I'm a lecturer in marketing at Bangor University. And today I'm going to be talking about a paper I completed for the second part of the PG Cert HE qualification last year. And it's a systematic review of factors impacting student academic engagement in online learning. So in the presentation, I will give an outline of what we mean by student academic engagement, though I'm sure you all have a good idea of what I'm talking about. Then I'll talk about why it's so important to understand student academic engagement in online learning settings. I'll outline the research aim, which is one of 2 that I covered in my paper, but I'm going to focus on one today. Outline the methods utilised, present the key themes that were identified and some key discussion points, and then provide the conclusions of the research. So student academic engagement is the degree to which students are actively involved in their learning tasks. And it's something that's so important in higher education. It's a buzzword that we hear day in, day out. And that's because it has been shown to have a very positive impact on higher education learning outcomes. Things like how persistent students are in their learning, how satisfied they are with their learning and their course, and the rate at which students complete the course. And it's got 3 key components. There is the cognitive component element, which is the degree to which students are invested in their learning for understanding and mastering really challenging concepts. Then we have the affective form of engagement, and that's students' sort of emotional and affective reactions and interactions. How do they feel about the instructor and their fellow students and the tasks that they're having to complete in their learning? And of course, we have the behavioural component, which is what students actually do. Do they turn in the assignments? Do they attend class? And these 3 components of student engagement together make up what we tend to measure as student engagement. Now, with COVID-19, it turned education on its head in higher education. Many universities that have always run their courses in face-to-face settings had to move to online settings. And there's been a lot of demand for online courses in higher education institutions following COVID. But even before the pandemic, there was increasing year-on-year interest in online courses at higher education. So I think it's really important that we get to grips with how we can enhance academic student engagement in higher education in online learning settings. Now, if you cast your mind back to the start of the pandemic, if you taught then, you may have found that you had all these materials and these courses designed for in-person teaching. But to keep teaching going, we had to translate them and put them online and teach them that way. And you may have found that students weren't as engaged when some of these activities that students love in the classroom, they're not that bothered about in an online setting. And that's because teaching and learning online is just such a different beast. And Ferrer and colleagues have argued recently that all of the engagement theories that we utilize have been developed and validated for face-to-face teaching. And we can't assume that they're just going to apply to online settings. So all the things that we've learned over the years to enhance student academic engagement in face-to-face settings may not work in online settings. So we need to understand why that is and how we can enhance student engagement. Now, the reason that online learning is so different, well, there's a variety of factors identified in the literature. It's more complicated. At the outset, students have to navigate technologies just to start learning. And there's a lot of barriers that can be encountered when trying to use technology. Like some of our students found that their internet was very laggy. And so when they were trying to stream lectures, it would constantly break up. So these students have a harder time out of the gate. Students who are learning online also have a greater risk of feeling isolated and alienated from others because they don't have that day-to-day interaction with the student group. And they have a greater need to feel connected to other people on their course and the instructors. They also miss out on really important feedback loops that just naturally occur in a classroom setting that we can't really replicate online in the same way, because these are organic interactions. And research has suggested that online learners need to be more motivated, have better organisation, and have greater self-discipline if they are to excel in online learning relative to students learning the same things in a face-to-face setting. So what I wanted to do was try and understand what is currently known about student academic engagement in higher education, to see if I can find some things that we can do to try and make online learning a little more effective. And the research question that I wanted to address was what factors are shown to influence student academic engagement in online learning at higher education institutions. To answer the research question, I conducted a systematic review of studies that look at online learning, student academic engagement in higher education. So the search strategy was to conduct a Boolean search with 3 focal areas. So they had to include student academic engagement, online learning, or higher education areas. Now, a variety of terms were used for each of these focal areas, and search results had to have all 3 criteria to be eligible for the study. The searches were conducted in a number of databases. Essentially, I looked at previous systematic reviews in education and looked at what databases they looked at and followed suit. The literature search was conducted by the end of June 2021, and studies at any date published at any date before that time could be included. For the analysis method, it was a qualitative thematic analysis using inductive semantic approach. Essentially, once the items were identified, key information was placed into a database, and every incidence of anything related to student engagement was noted. This was then used to create broad themes under which there were sub-themes that identified factors that may enhance or inhibit academic student engagement in higher education institutions. So my PRISMA framework is presented on the right. You can see in the identification box, there were 3,111 records, and 390 were duplicates. And then the screening process began, which was involved looking at the titles, abstracts, and keywords for each article. If it wasn't possible to determine its eligibility based on the title, abstract, and keywords, I read the entire paper. So the criteria for inclusion was that it was a primary piece of research, it was related to online learning in higher education settings, and it explicitly looked at student academic engagement in some form. It had to be a peer-reviewed article in an academic journal or a conference proceeding. Conference proceedings were included to try and tap into any new knowledge that had been gleaned from the pandemic. and they had to be published in the English language. They were excluded if they covered in-person teaching, hybrid learning without separate analyses for online learning, if they were not focused on higher education, if they investigated massive online open courses, if they only reported secondary research, and if they examined a specific learning technology, such as the use of Second Life or digital whiteboard platforms. And the rationale for that is that there has been quite a bit of focus in the past on some platforms like Second Life, but they do feel a bit outdated. So this resulted in 23 items being included in the review. And a quick look at the list here. Full references I can show you after if you're interested. It was just a lot to include on a slide. So, factors impacting engagement in online learning at higher education. The 4 key themes that were identified included course design, instructor support, learning community, and student-centred factors. Now, within humour, this was found to enhance cognitive and behavioural engagement with a range of course tasks and materials. And it also was found to enhance the emotional engagement with the entire course. So the use of humour could be very effective in the classroom. Now, that doesn't mean that we're all expected to be comedians, but we might be able to have a humorous element here and there that might make students engage a little bit more. Okay. The nature of the learning task has also been shown to be important. So assignments that are designed to facilitate a high level of learning have been shown to make students more engaged. The use of a variety of online activities and tools such as multimedia and discussion boards have also been shown to enhance students' emotional engagement. So they like those things. It adds variety. And also the perceived usefulness of the online learning systems. So the more that students feel that the online systems they're using are beneficial to them, the more engaged that they will be in using those platforms. If they feel they're a bit of a waste of time or a faff, they tend to engage much less. If students get technological issues whilst trying to undertake tasks, such as if they cannot log into an online lecture or they can't access a quiz, they are likely to be much less engaged, not just on that occasion, but going forward. Instructor support is also very important, as I'm sure you could guess. Scaffolding for interaction has been shown to be very important, where if instructors build into the course opportunities for instructor-student and student-student interactions, this will enhance student engagement. For example, giving students a task to discuss amongst themselves, and the instructor listening in, and at times where students are getting close to a point they want to get, the instructor might give feedback and give them a little nudge. So this has proven to be quite effective. This can be done in breakout rooms and such. Instructor guidance and assistance is also really important, as are engaging lecturers. So you don't want someone teaching you who is a bit boring and doesn't inspire you, doesn't engage you. And also the instructors who are quick to provide help also help enhance engagement. Students tend to be less engaged if they have to wait for advice and guidance. They get a bit fed up. In terms of learning community then, students really benefit from having formal and informal interaction with both the instructor and fellow students. And there are many different ways that we can build in opportunities for students to talk to each other. However, it's really important that we don't give them lots of options. Students are talking across platforms, and then students end up not having responses because they're talking on a platform other students don't particularly like, because that's shown to lower student engagement. We also have student-centred factors. If we can enhance student self-regulation, and we can enhance their academic self-efficacy, this is shown to enhance the level of student engagement. So in conclusion, face-to-face and online learning environments cannot be treated equally. And it's really important that the development, delivery and support provided in online learning takes into account the very unique aspects of online learning that makes it challenging. Courses should be designed to facilitate engagement, and instructors may benefit from thinking about course design, instructor support, creating learning communities and enhancing student self-regulation. And they may also benefit from explicitly thinking about the activities that they get students to do and how they will enhance the cognitive, affective and behavioural engagement of the student. Okay, so the discussion points that I had today, what are the most effective strategies that you've found that facilitate student academic engagement in your online teaching? And what are the main challenges that you have found at facilitating online student academic engagement? Okay, thank you very much.
Great presentation, thank you very much. I want to ask two quick questions, if I may. The first one is, if you could please tell us a little bit more about how did you define online learning and how it differs from online teaching? Because I can see that you have excluded MOOCs, and I'm assuming similar learning management platforms to be used. So I was wondering, how did you define it? And you started and ended your presentation with the point of engagement factors might be quite different in real world and face-to-face settings compared to online settings. In your results, you have presented, I think, about 8 to 10 factors. Which one of these factors do you think would not actually be relevant to real-world settings in terms of engaging students in teaching and learning activities?
Okay, so I'll try and remember both questions. In relation to the first one, online teaching was one of the search terms. So with the, let me see if I can go back. Where is it? I'm not sure where it's gone now. But with the search terms, that was included. So it would have been online learning, online teaching, would have been one of the strings that were used. So those factors are included in the review. And secondly, you asked which of these factors might not work as well in face-to-face settings. I think it's kind of the relative importance that is perhaps key, and the nature and how we use these tools. So we might have to adapt them versus it being simply it works in one setting and it doesn't. I think students perhaps need more connection when they're online than they do in the classroom, because that can happen outside of the classroom too. During the pandemic, when we started teaching in face-to-face settings, some of these students hadn't met each other, and we weren't allowed to get them to do group work. So they didn't get to know each other as well as we'd like, but they had friendships outside of the classroom, but within the student community, and they seemed to really relish that support. So perhaps that's less important, but I would still argue that it is important to take into account too. It just needs to be developed differently online than on face-to-face settings. Okay. Thank you for those questions.
Hi. So first of all, thank you so much for the great presentation. So my question is based on my experience with teaching 2 online courses. In the first semester, so my assessment criteria did not include anything related to engagement, but I noticed that the students were not engaging enough. So in the second semester, I basically changed the assessment criteria and included some marks on the engagement. So somehow I forced them to engage. So did you come up with anything related to the type of assessment that might impact the engagement through the systematic review?
Not in that regard, not sort of. It's kind of what you're talking about is almost like forced engagement, isn't it? So you make them and hope it has the desired outcome. Hopefully it did. Nothing to suggest one assignment or type would be better that I came across. Not in those studies, sorry.
Thank you.
Hello,
there.
congratulations, very good presentation. I just wanted to find out, like when you were doing the analysis of articles, did you identify the kind of activities people were doing, you know, to maximize the engagement? Because I was also teaching online, obviously, for the, you know, during COVID, and I saw that when the activities are not something that you kind of force them to come online, they won't do it. So I resorted to a lot of online whiteboarding. When they use all this, you know, post-its and they were scrambling on the screen, they get excited about that, but it's only for a few minutes. It's not too long, you know what I mean? So it becomes like, how do I keep that? How do I sustain that engagement? So did you find anything in that?
There was one study that suggested that if it's related to an assessment, then students will do it. And if it's not related to an assessment, then students won't be particularly bothered. You'll get some who see the value, but generally if it's not linked explicitly to an assignment, students are less likely to do it. Things like doing quizzes and interactive stuff within class time did tend to help. But there isn't a huge amount of information on what gets students to engage. I mean, some say that discussion boards are very effective. However, in my own experience, it didn't work for me. So I do think it's part of the way that courses are structured and the student group. And that's a limitation of the review, is that there are so few studies that are currently looking at this or have already looked at this, that we're sort of very close to the start of investigating it. And I think this is something that just needs a lot more research in the future so we can identify exactly what will help. But a variety of tasks certainly does seem to help. And you say they do get interested for a few minutes and then not so much.
Hello, thank you ever so much. I really enjoyed listening to you. I'm just wondering, from my experiences of online teaching, which sound very similar to yours, sometimes horrendous, feeling like I was talking to a complete void. I'm just wondering, we have very diverse range of students where I work, University of East London, and we were finding from our sort of cohort that there are topics that we might discuss within a, I guess, classroom setting that are quite sensitive, sort of culturally, within religions and you know, families. And different generations of families may feel they don't want their young people having access or participating within those conversations. So obviously when they're in the classroom, they have an option to leave, or they can, and they're sort of more willing to have those conversations. When they're at home, perhaps within a house or a flat, you know, a lot of us do live in, you know, quite small accommodation with generations of families, people walking past, people looking over their shoulders, that seemed to really have an impact on their ability to engage in the conversations that are perhaps more sensitive. Is that something that you found, or did that come through?
It didn't come through in a review, but I teach marketing, but we do look at some more provocative materials. And I did find that there were students who would typically be quite vocal, that maybe don't want to address those things. They don't want it on the screen if they're sat in the dining room. And sometimes students would, you know, turn their cameras on and you can see their family in the background. And that's, it's very difficult to navigate that. I don't have the same experience with the sensitive topics as you do, but I think that's a really big barrier, and it's not something I've thought in any depth to, so that's something I will take back and think about in more.
I mean, to add that, we also got a number of our students are also parents, so obviously they were also having their youngsters around, so even it was potentially not having the conversations when, you know, you've got a 6-year-old running around behind you and things like that, and those sorts of things, as well as cultural and stuff. Yeah, it was a whole, yeah.
So when you said it was a nightmare, you actually mean it was a real nightmare at times?
Yeah. I mean, it is what it is, but yeah. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, next is me. So my name's Nikki Dolfer. I'm from Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. So I work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Their land was stolen, it was never ceded, and that's really important to us in Melbourne to remember. I'm coming at almost the exact opposite end of this. So I've been teaching online for 10 years, and this is a study of a course that we have been teaching for those 10 years, but I'm so glad I'm following Georgina because she's just done the lit review. So I think I'm going to skip that bit for me, so this is really good. We're looking at how we created learning communities using online strategies and in online environments, which we found to be an interesting process. Luckily, because we have been doing online learning for so long, this study took place just before COVID hit. Possibly it wouldn't have mattered for us that COVID had hit because we'd already been online for so long, but we were lucky it did take place before then. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that there is a difference between emergency remote teaching, as Hodges calls it, which is what has been happening during the pandemic, and online teaching and learning, which has in fact been going on for many, many years, and distance education, which predates that. So there is a long and wonderful tradition of this type of learning, and the sort of learning that I'm going to be talking about today is the online education. The reason the study exists is because we had been teaching a master's course, an international master's course, for a long time, and we had noticed in our anecdotal conversations with students that they actually had a very strong sense of belonging to a cohort. You know, they would set up their own alumni groups, they would invite us if they were in the country. So I went to visit Singapore, there was a group of students there, I was invited to go and have dinner with the families and so on. And this struck us as really interesting because the literature generally talks about the fact that there is less of a sense of engagement and belonging within the online learning. So this prompted us to sort of start to think, okay, maybe we should investigate what the students are thinking here. So what we've done is we've drawn on the work of Kift and Peacock and Cowan to explore the potential links between the cognitive and the environmental domains. So we're really thinking about synchronous learning and asynchronous learning, okay, the two quite distinct types of activities supporting each other. And we're hoping that the knowledge from this study, if we ever finally get it published, will actually start to inform further studies as we go ahead. So, for the purposes of this study, online learning is based on the Singer-Thurman flipped model. Okay, so within this, what we mean is that the students have flipped learning arrangements, things that they do asynchronously before they come into what we call a webinar, and then they come into a webinar once a week. This is interesting because our students are in so many different parts of the world, but we'll go through that a little more. We're building on the work of Goodenow for our definition of a sense of belonging. Now, she is a school person, not a higher education person, we recognise that, although her definitions are moving more and more into higher ed. But the key things that go with her definition are they see themselves as an important part of the life and activity of the class. They are accepted, valued, included, and encouraged by others, and they have involved support and the respect for personal autonomy. So we started with these as our key definitions moving forward as we started to talk to the students and find out about their experiences. For our particular research, we've actually gone backwards in time, and we're going back to the distance education model that Moore suggests from 1989. There have been a lot of discussions of the way that we design online learning. You hear about teacher presence, you hear about engagement and so on. We went back, Moore was one of the original writers in this space, and he believed there were three key areas. So he believed there was the learner-instructor interaction, the learner-learner interaction, and the learner-content interaction. And if you look at that, of course, learner sits at the centre of everything, so it's always there. And his idea was that if we can make sure that all three of those things are in place, then the experience of connection and belonging is actually supported. So there's a lot on this screen. You don't have to see it all, but I should talk a little bit about the methodology. We used a constructivist epistemology approach. We were looking at mixed methods. We put out surveys to alumni, and we also invited people to take part in focus groups, or they could take part in individual interviews. We only spoke to the alumni of the one course that we had had this history of fairly positive responses to, so it was very purposive sampling from that sense. The research team consisted of 2 lecturers from within the degree, okay, so that there was a connection to the students, but we were a bit worried that that would bias the sample, so we also included somebody who was outside of the degree to whom students could say, "Are you nuts? This is terrible." So we made sure that that opportunity was made available. We ended up getting 20 participants who filled in surveys with both open-ended and closed questions. We had 2 focus groups of 4 participants in each focus group and 4 individual interviews. The individual interviews were the ones taken by the independent researcher, and our alumni knew that that was who would be taking those. So there was always the opportunity of talking. As you can see, we're in multiple countries, so trying to find time zones to do focus groups was interesting, but we made it. We got there eventually. We have alumni all over the world. This is a very, very international course based on an international curriculum, so it has its own nuances. Some of these people have taken up to 7 years to complete what would be a 2-year course. Others have done it very quickly. So, there's quite a stretch in terms of who's involved. When we analysed the responses from the survey, the focus groups and the interviews, we asked them about prior experiences of online learning. At this stage, and you remember we hadn't all moved to emergency remote teaching, at this stage we had students who had had very different experiences of online learning up until this point. They felt that they were more detached in the previous courses. They found online forums inefficient. They found them difficult to use and hard to get any real dialogue. They found them very isolating. But on the positive side, there is a sense that the lecturers doing these courses know what they're doing. They've got the content. They know that backwards, forwards and sideways. What they haven't managed to do is moving to that personal connection that the students were seeking. So we then, using the Moore framework, started to think about the lecturer-instruction interaction. Now, I should tell you that many of these, this was in the Zoom time before you could have a different background. So these people are looking into your house and you're looking into theirs. In fact, on one day, I sincerely was looking into somebody's lounge room and I must have seen 30 people go behind, at various points. So it's a very open environment. It's really important that that's sort of there. What that means, of course, is that the instructor's house is open to them as well. So they know your dog, your cat, your children, and everyone else that is coming through your home. Our students saw that as a positive. They really liked the fact that, they could see Archie and Alfie in the background, or that they could see the baby who'd just been born. They felt that that personal connection was really helpful. They tended to keep their cameras on. Very few of our participants turned their cameras off. They talk about the fact that they didn't expect to build the relationships with their lecturers, but that it was actually really lovely. They liked the very ordinariness of day-to-day contact in the Zoom room. They liked the fact that we talked about something silly that had happened, or that there was a bit of a joke about the weather in each different country, or, all of those things were going on. They liked the very ordinary conversation. They felt that the instructors involved in the course had really bothered to try to connect. When it comes to learner-learner interaction, in this course, the students do have to do some assessments together, so they have a collaborative assessment working in pairs. Some of them can choose not to do that, so a number of them, once they get going, kind of go, oh, this is really hard, I'm in a different time zone, and that is okay. They're not penalised. But a number of them actually like the working in pairs. It's interesting, collaborative work, there's always somebody who hates it and somebody who loves it. It seems to in the whole, work in this particular course, because they're only working in a pair. They liked coming into the webinar. The webinar goes for an hour and a half every week. It's in the evening, quite late, for those of us who are actually teaching it in Australia. And they like coming in, they like hearing other people's perspectives, they really like getting a sense of where people are in the world and what they're hearing. They love the opportunity to chat. In fact, sometimes you cannot make them stop chatting, particularly when the chat room is next to you and you're, talking about, I don't know, I'm talking about international mindedness. And what I see come up in the chat room is, Nikki's got a new hairdo. Has anyone noticed Nikki's got a new hairdo? And I'm like, really? Focus? So you can get a sense of the sort of communities that they moved into. They liked the fact that they were able to help each other out. So the other thing that happened in the chat room is somebody would say an acronym, and gosh, there's a lot of acronyms around the world, and somebody would write in the chat room, what's that? And then somebody else would answer it. I didn't have to do any of that. The students were moderating themselves, managing it. They all felt that whilst it was, they were different, they all had something to contribute. We really made sure that people understood that this was a reciprocal learning environment. We were there, we were facilitating, but we were not the sage on the stage. And they liked the fact that they were driving towards a common goal. So everyone's heading in the same direction. It's not a competition, it's a community. The learner content interaction was interesting to us because we do put so much up at a time. So they get an entire, subject's worth at the beginning, and they can work through it at their own speed, but they do, ideally, attend a weekly webinar. They like the idea of having the material to go through themselves, and then if they're not understanding something, go through it again. They like all of those sorts of things. They like the consistency. So every week there's a roadmap. This is our topic this week. These are the sorts of things we'll be looking at. Here are the tasks you need to try and do before you come to class. Here are the da-da-da. So they like that consistency. They like the fact that it's all there. So for some of them, they would go through everything in the first week, and then they'd come back and do it again slowly. The weekly webinar they really found was probably the single thing that they found most valuable through the whole process. And that the reason that they commented that they found was valuable is best brought together by that bottom comment. It's an exchange rather than a download. I try really hard not to talk too much in the webinars. I try really hard, and it's a killer, to make sure that we're hearing the voices in the room, not my voice, as do the other instructors in the course. So, in conclusion, I think it is possible to establish personal connection with instructors and peers. I have been to 6 countries whilst teaching this course, and in every country I have been invited out to dinner with a group of whoever's in that country. It's great, I've had the best food. And it seemed like a very personal relationship. Mind you, I did get a bit of a shock when the guy that I taught on class, who I just assumed was a normal-sized human being, was actually 6'10", because Zoom doesn't show you that. But, there is a lovely personal nature to it. We do think that sense of belonging can grow strongly. We think the teacher disposition is incredibly important. The openness of the teacher and the willingness to be part of that community rather than the fount of all knowledge is really important. This course is actually originally taught. It was originally taught by 3 women, 2 of whom were over the age of 60 and were not particularly technically savvy. So the idea that you need to be technologically advanced is bunkum, okay? So the bottom line is teacher disposition, pedagogical awareness and versatility were far more important than the technical prowess. And I'd like to leave you with the thought that we can always improve. We know that our course is not perfect, but the idea that, in fact, it is the very ordinary that we do in the classroom as a teacher, that hello, how are you, that connection, what's your day been like, that actually brings to life the online learning as much as it does in the classroom. Thank you. Right, any questions?
Also from the University of Melbourne, so...
Yay, hi!
It's time for bed. in fact, should be well asleep. The Moore's framework with the learner content, learner instructor, where do you see the learner-environment relationship sit in that dynamic?
Yeah, so I actually think the learner environment sits right in the middle of it in many ways, because the way we create an environment is through the relationships. So teaching is relational, so that comes through the instructor. Learning is relational or constructive in this particular course, so that comes through the peers. And then the content is also, in this case, an environment on its own. So I think it sits centrally. It's a good question, but yeah, that's the thing I would be adding.
And just one thing, I think I've seen a similar diagram where it's also around it. So
there you go, perfect.
Central around it, but thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi, thanks, Nikki. Really like that exchange rather than the download. You've mentioned about they all kept their cameras on. Was that sort of a rule you had at the start of the course, or
Yeah,
we've struggled with a lot?
It's interesting. A lot of people at my university say they cannot get people to turn their cameras on. We've not had that problem. Originally, when we started the course, it was kind of a rule. Once COVID hit, we actually discovered cameras starting to go off a bit more, and I thought, oh, that's a change. It is a course for teachers who are already qualified. So we usually start it by saying, as a teacher, what do you depend on to do your work? And one of the things that came through was the ability to see what my students are doing. And I said, right, well, you're kind of handicapping me, or you're making it really difficult for us to do this. I think also once the majority of the cameras are on, peer pressure does the rest. They kind of go, oh, okay, I'll leave mine on. I've seen people eating, I've seen people, like the things you see them do on the camera is extraordinary. And that's okay. It's just part of the fun. So, yeah.
Great presentation, thank you. I really enjoyed the quotes that you have provided as well. I was wondering if you have collected any information, any data, or do you have any insights with regards to the kind of offline interaction with the resources of those students and how this engagement influences their online sessions from which you have generated some data and insights. And kind of related to this, I was wondering if you are familiar with or interested in looking at one's ability to regulate their learning behaviors, to be able to engage in advance of the online session with these offline activities, and because I was surprised not to see any particular theory connection to, let's say, self-regulated learning, considering how much work has been done in spaces like learning analytics. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just trying to put that all together. So, sorry, the first part of the question, can you just repeat it one more time for me? Sorry, jet lag is really kicking in now.
Sorry, to put it simply, do you have any data on students' engagement with
the... Yeah, okay, all right. So within the learning management system that we have this housed, we do have the ability to track whether students are accessing materials and how long they're online for. We can tell you which videos they've watched, where they've cut out. We can tell you which readings they've downloaded. We can tell you how long they have spent on the site. But of course, if they keep their computer on for a while and go have a cup of tea and sleep, that is still classed as on the site, right? So some of these informatics are not as trustworthy as we would like. When we first started, we were a bit sort of, I'm going to say, school teachery, and we'd kind of go, we really hope you've done all the work this week. And then we thought, hang on, there's another way to do this. So what we've done is each week students have tasks that they are responsible for. So they take a task from the week's flipped environment, so the asynchronous work, and they present it, or they run that part of the class in the actual webinar. And that has helped us with buy-in far more than any single other thing, because they feel like they're letting their colleagues down if they're not doing it. If they don't do the work, so there are times when I look at them and they look very tired and, you know, it's very late at night and it's been a long year, and I say to them, have you all had a look at this activity where we did this? And because we've over the time built a fairly honest relationship, half the hands will go, I haven't done it. And I will say, okay, is there somebody in the room who'd like to just give a quick précis and then we'll move forward? So we've kind of, you cannot really tell how much they do or do not do, but we do assess a certain amount of what they do, and they wouldn't be able to actually pass some of the course unless they'd interacted with some of the materials. Now, I'm going to sit down because I think I've gone over time.
Okay, good afternoon. It's really great to follow Nikki, Georgina's presentations, because we're also looking at student engagement, and we're looking at in terms of student transitions. So it's great to be here. So I'm Emma Rawlings-Smith from the University of Oxford. Last year I was working at Bangor University, and together with Kieran and Nick, we were involved in a Welsh government-funded project looking at student transitions to university. That was completed last year. And this paper briefly introduces the project, outlines the research design before discussing some of our qualitative findings, recommendations and institutional learning that we've sort of implemented in, particularly at Cardiff Met. So a report and journal article are currently in review, and they will hopefully be published later this year. So in terms of sort of introducing this, the National Strategy for Educational Research and Inquiry had a collaborative evidence network set up, and as part of the strategy, there was the aim to share evidence on the impact of the pandemic on the Welsh education system, to identify evidence gaps, promote collaborative evidence gathering to fill these gaps. So last September, there was a call for expressions of interest for people who wanted to be part of this project, and the reports had to be written by March this year. So it was quite a condensed time frame, and myself and Kieran and Nick wanted to consider student engagement, because we'd all been thinking about and doing online learning with our first year students, but we were really quite interested in those students who'd been in schools and colleges, their experiences of COVID, online learning, and what we could learn from that, so that when they came into universities we could support them. And so the focus is really on the impact of the pandemic, as you can see on the slide, and the recovery process and what we could do to support that. We realised that there is a lack of empirical evidence on student transitions to universities in Wales, and that was exacerbated in the pandemic. As we were going through the literature over the last sort of 9 months or so, there's a proliferation of studies being carried out on how pandemic has been impacting learning. So there was a lot of reading for us to do. So in terms of the research design, so this paper adds to the evidence base on first-year undergrad student experiences and engagement during their transition to the Welsh universities. And our mixed methods study adopted an interpretive and inductive approach, and credibility of the evidence was ensured with the use of 2 data collection tools and by drawing on the experiences of students enrolled at several institutions across Wales. So the survey utilised Krauss and Coates' 2008 first-year engagement scale, and that focused on students' academic, social and digital preparedness for university. So we added several open-ended questions to that online survey. So we had 90 students respond to that. And the last question asked if they wanted to be involved in focus groups. And so from those students that put in their details, we then carried out focus groups with 18 students to find out more information about their experiences over the last sort of 12 months or so before they enrolled in university, to understand their experiences. Because as Georgina said, there's a lot in the literature about student engagement, but we didn't know what students were actually thinking and experiencing in that time. So I've just left on that slide the academic engagement scale. So there were 7 elements to Krauss and Coates, and this was just one of them. So you can see the sort of scale items that were part of the questionnaire. So I don't have time to run through all the literature on student engagement and thinking about transition, but what I thought it might be worth doing is just take a moment to consider transition. So according to Meehan and Howes, transition to university and the student's state of being, belonging and becoming are critical to understand in order to engage students for a successful experience in higher education. We liked that definition, but what we were concerned about was the idea that transition is quite often seen to be, the transition to university is kind of like you pack up your children's stuff into the car, you appear to university, you dump them in halls and then you leave. You know, so it's like a moment. But transition isn't a moment, it's a slow process. So therefore we were quite concerned about seeing transition as a slow process, a long process to take, and so we put it into those 5 phases. And then in terms of student engagement, I've mentioned about Krauss and Coates identifying these 7 dimensions of engagement, and we just wanted to highlight that engagement is about students sort of devoting time to educational purposeful activities that contribute directly to desired outcomes. And we wanted to think, you know, what is that engagement? And so we wanted to find out more, and we wanted to find out from students what they thought that was. And I'm just going to jump straight through to we grouped a lot of our information about student engagement into 5 areas, and because of time constraints, we'll move on to think about some of those findings, and I'll pass over to Kieran.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, so I've got the task of trying to refine our findings into 5 minutes, so bear with me. What I've done is, in terms of the engagement scales, I've grouped academic and intellectual together, peer and staff and student engagement together, and then online engagement as digital. So academic, social, and digital. To start with, probably the most obvious finding is that students' transition to university has been affected by COVID-19. The closure of educational institutions, so pre-transition, meant that students have experienced fewer pre-university and extracurricular activities. I think a lot of the participants within the study were also quite dismayed by the fact that they had no chance to prove themselves by taking exams prior to university, because obviously they were cancelled as well. So generally, students were quite anxious to transition to university, but generally they felt academically fairly well prepared. In terms of the experience at university, hybrid learning enabled students to catch up on missed educational opportunities, so it worked fairly well in that sense during lockdown. Hybrid learning also, I think we've mentioned this already, but hybrid learning also allowed students to manage their time and juggle other commitments. So a lot of the participants within our project were mature students, or students with children, or students with part-time jobs. So I think that hybrid approach worked fairly well in that sense. Overall, however, we found that even if hybrid learning enabled students to improve their academic engagement, the majority of our participants actually considered in-person learning to be the most effective approach. And it's just quite important to highlight here that some of the participants were actually able to go onto campus during those small moments during the pandemic where things started to relax a little bit before it didn't. Excellent. So in terms of social, bear with me a second. In terms of social, again, COVID-19 has impacted the students' ability to develop socially. It generally prevented students from receiving and accessing support from staff prior to transition into university. We did find generally that the participants struggled to develop connections with other students. There were opportunities to do that throughout at times. They did struggle with a lack of support that they received from peers and staff during the transition, and this did impact upon their well-being and mental health as well. A big, I think this has been mentioned already, and a fairly obvious one, but isolation and loneliness was a fairly significant theme from our research. it did impact, especially in the first 6 months of university. So that was a fairly significant finding too. Finally, in terms of the social element of it, receiving support from staff played a crucial role, especially during the first 6 months of university. That was a significant finding. And effective communication between students and staff using a variety of channels, so Teams, Zoom, was really significant and really important to the participants within the project. Finally, in terms of digital access to resources was not universal. I think we all, not in this room, but I think generally we assume that every student has access to a laptop, running Wi-Fi, so students generally struggled at times to access online learning due to outdated digital equipment and poor internet connection. Students had a wide range of digital literacy skills, with the majority of them feeling digitally fairly well prepared. It was acknowledged that universities provided a wide range of services to support online learning, but even so, students or participants needed additional support from the universities using VLEs, Moodle, Blackboard, etc. Finally, students felt disengaged and they lacked focus when attending online seminars, which is quite interesting in comparison to some of the other talks that's happened already today. And students would like to generally see a reduction in online seminars as they found face-to-face learning more effective, more engaging, interactive, and motivating to attend. I'll pass you on to Nick, who's going to discuss through the recommendations.
It's a very news night here. Our participants were very vocal about their recommendations. You can read them here, but I'm going to bring a few of those to life of how we're addressing it this year in terms of what we're doing in our institution. So the first thing is a really important period we neglected as an institution, in that one of the students called a desert period, from the period when they accept the offer through to when they actually start. And that can really start with feelings of isolation, lack of communication, and not start off on the right foot. So what we've done this year, we've created a welcome page, interviews with staff. We've worked really closely with our year one reps to really ask them, what would you want if you were going to start again? So this welcome web page was sent to all new freshers who've accepted. So I've just been answering some questions on, do I need a pencil case this morning? Just that whole ability to talk to lecturers has really helped. And what they've been able to, we've set up on that welcome web page a Teams forum. So they've got some connections. So on that first day, there's real anxiety our participants talked about was walking into that first lecture theatre. So they've got some people to meet with. They know they can go for coffee in the morning with people. So I think that's going to help. It's been mentioned a lot by Georgina, obviously some of the negativity around online learning. What was really clear, one of the very clear recommendations was this return to face-to-face. And I think obviously the teaching's important, but what really stood out was just those abilities to build connections after the session and just unpack what has happened in the session, just going for coffee. One of our students talked about, getting dressed for a session, and that really helped their focus come into a physical space. So what we've done in our institution, we've got a lot more breakout rooms, a lot more social spaces to really encourage students to come onto campus. And our timetables have changed, so they're on for 2 intensive days, again, to try and mirror some of their quite hectic lives for students, especially with the cost of living. A lot of them are working now. A lot of them, have children, I'm sure, the same for your institutions. Finally, as well, my children laugh a lot at me, calling me a wannabe influencer. We've set up this YouTube channel, so we've tried to help with online guidance, simple things like what is a lecture, what is a seminar, how are they different? And they've been really popular. So we've got a YouTube channel that our course uses, but also other students from other courses are starting to use as well. There were recommendations for schools and colleges, which I won't go into in too much detail. One of the things, again, that stood out was, I think, this misconception that, because a lot of our students are younger, they were these digital natives and they were going to be great with technology. And I was really surprised myself. I teach a lot of the digital aspects of the course. They really need to support with basic packages of Moodle, PowerPoint, and again, a lot of our videos and guidance, we've had to provide those on that YouTube channel. In terms of final thoughts, if we could skip on. Oh, there. Okay. Just to provoke some discussion, really. I mean, Georgina's already covered a lot of this, but just to hear what other institutions are doing, and always good to hear about other practice. So maybe to provoke some questions, it'd be great to hear of what you're doing in terms of flexibility, but also, you know, in terms of what institutions are doing to promote that social learning as well, would be great to hear about. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the presentation, very interesting. And I have one question and maybe just a suggestion on what to do for courses. The question first. So your students are moving from secondary education to higher education. I've been a secondary education teacher for 7 years, so they are moving from a system of spoon feeding to a system of self-direction for studying. So you were making the comment of digital native, which nowadays we don't say it anymore, we call more, I've came across the concept of digital plasticity. So we do have the ability to move in between what we consider that we don't know how to use to what we are going to use very efficiently. So I wonder how much of the difficulties that they have is not necessarily because of the digital tools that they have to use, but because of the way expectations changed from the secondary education to the higher education. So that's my question. If you have looked into the possibility that the student struggle might be not necessarily for the format, but because they have to go from one expectation to the other. And then a suggestion, I have now second year students, which are very similar, still very similar to first year students. And one thing I found really useful is the use of infographics. So when I present a course, in the first page of my course, there is an infographic which has been made by using, I use two different tools. One is Genially to make the infographic, and then is Fingerlink to create interactive elements. So in my infographic, there are all the things that are most important in the course, which generally are the ELOs, the assessments, criteria. And although these things are in the handbook as well, but students don't read it. So I just extrapolated from the handbook what I needed. Everything was in that one picture infographic. Seemed to help. It's just started that, so I'm not really sure. So question and suggestion, if you...
Do you want me to do it?
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of the question, I think it's a really good one. When we started the project, we in terms of the restrictions and access to participants, using university students was a fairly obvious one. I think one of the limitations of it, though, and one of the future research directions for the three of us is to start focusing on the kind of school element of it a little bit more, so the pre-transition phase. Because a lot of what we did was obviously post-transition, and we asked them to reflect backwards. So it's not really an answer, it's just that, you know, that's kind of where we're looking at for the future. I think we wanted to engage with schools and colleges during a pandemic and the busy lives of school teachers. It was difficult to do that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of what we're hoping to do next is to include schools and colleges. And thank you for the suggestion on the second one.
I think this cohort as well was quite unique. Obviously, they were quite negative with education and their experience at school and college. Yeah, and they'd missed so many things. So I think with newer students coming through, it might be different, but yeah, fortunately, I'm the best experience.
Thank you again. This is sort of another sort of really interesting area sort of to be looking at, and transition from my history as a primary school teacher, going into HE over the last few years or so, and thinking about SEN, and being a parent of youngsters that have been to and are heading into university. This is like, yay. One of mine went, when they were going, just had a little postcard sent home to say, we're really looking forward to meeting you. And I thought that was really quite just cute, really. And they were like, oh yeah, right. But as a parent, that made me sort of think, oh, that's quite nice. I'm wondering, with part of your study, and actually sort of thinking about that primary school, when you're looking at working with schools, it might be worth actually going right down to those primary schools and including them as well, because actually they've worked so hard on transition into secondaries and with secondaries over the last donkey's years that they will have a huge amount of valuable information, because it's the same thing. It's a transition. It's exactly the same thing. The same children, the same people, it's, you know, all the same issues. But within that, thinking about SEN, which is also my kind of area, how are you encouraging more youngsters with SEN to brave out that transition, and how are you actually thinking about making that transition easier and more inclusive for those?
Do you mean to?
I think you've made some really good points there, particularly I was a secondary school teacher, and there's that thing in year 7 where teachers go, right, welcome to geography, and it's like, well, actually, no, there's a hinterland of knowledge that students have had in primary, that it's not a point. So you're absolutely right that it's really important to have those transitions noted, and an awareness that everyone knows what they can do. And I think one of the things that we were thinking about with conceptualising transitions, not as a moment, but actually as something that you lead up to in a long time, is that it stops, for example, our A-level students thinking just about their exam results, and therefore then it jumps into the next step. It's actually thinking, what else, what other sort of academic competencies, digital competencies do I need in order to get myself to the next step? In terms of being inclusive, I'm not a specialist in that area, but we thought that listening to the voices of a whole range of students from some really diverse backgrounds made us really aware of what was happening in their households, where they were learning, what that looked like. And, students didn't have their own desk in their own private study area. Some people were in the caravan in mum and dad's shop that was shut because of COVID, therefore that's the only place that they could find it. People would turn things around to hide stuff that's happening in the house. So very difficult situations. But in terms of SEN students, a lot of the sort of support that we can provide to all students needs to consider students as a really diverse group and not a homogenous group that have had a particular route through. For example, some of our, one of the students that we talked to was a student that had been home learning, so therefore couldn't get any grades through. And so, the generosity of the university to accept them not having those formal routes. And I think it's having that acceptance and understanding about the students that we're bringing into higher education is a really important element to what we can share as a recommendation.
So it doesn't address this, but something we've done is, I think, visibility is so important. And as part of our YouTube channel is having students' voices represented. So students with a range of disabilities, and they would talk about, what's a day in the life for, what are their challenges on the course. So it doesn't address it all, but I think just to be able to see that there's a range of abilities that attend university does help in some way.
I think, it's also interesting, sort of as you were saying there, I think particularly youngsters that have had support throughout school have had the support, they're almost told what they're getting, and yes, their views and their opinions and all that are taken, but they're still told what they can have, whereas I think when you sort of start heading into university, you've got to be a bit more proactive, haven't you? And it's actually that knowledge of how to go about doing that and to be proactive, and what you can ask for and what you can get, and how you should be confident enough to say, actually, I'm not quite getting what I need. How can you work together on this? I think is huge for our youngsters that have been almost oppressed, I suppose, and had their ability to speak up for themselves downtrodden. I think that's quite a huge, difference of expectations.